Marc Marquez is signing another contract to be a Ducati MotoGP rider still, but for how much longer will he be a Ducati MotoGP rider? Is this about to be his final contract in MotoGP? He's spoken a lot about retirement during his time in the Premier class. He's obviously not that old, just turned 33, but he's been through a lot in MotoGP, including the famous arm injury of 2020. And it feels like the prospect of Mark stepping away is maybe less real than it was at the height of his injury struggles, but more real since his second win in MotoGP. Would that be fair to say, Simon?
I actually think it's higher now than it was at the height of the injury struggles, because he always had something to prove while he was battling back from those arm injuries. And now that he's back, now that he's proved it, you have to wonder if maybe just the motivation is starting to slip a little bit. Because, I mean, what has the guy got to prove to the world? He's got one more year left in his current contract that will probably leave him the most successful MotoGP rider of all time, with a record that's going to take an awful long time for anyone to even come close to beating. You know, we're in a world where the closest guy to him has 2 titles and isn't that much younger than him. So I think it's very difficult to imagine that he's not, at least struggling to kind of pull himself out of bed in the morning with all the injuries and pains that he has. He's spoken quite recently and quite openly about that, about how essentially the injuries have aged him. And we're not just talking about the arm injury. It's worth noting that the 2 summers or the 2 winters before the arm injury, he spent fully recuperating from shoulder surgery. He then ended up having the same shoulder surgery again over this past winter. It's essentially been mid-2018 since Marc Marquez has been fully fit. So I get where he's coming from. I totally get it. You said, Val, that he's only in his early 30s, but I think we're a little bit, maybe a little bit. We've lost what old is in MotoGP, because Valentino Rossi pushed that boat out quite a bit and went sort of 10 years longer than most people. But actually, for a world champion and for one with Mark's CV, he's not far away from a fairly normal retirement age. This is where people start having these conversations. And if the contract that he's in the process of signing now, however long it might be, is his final MotoGP contract, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to anyone at all.
Yeah, I mean, he's still obviously, like, the performance does not come into it. We'll talk about his preseason in a second a little bit, but it's clear that he's good enough to keep winning either intermittently or consistently for the next 5 or however many years. It is hard to imagine a Marc Marquez on a bike who isn't able to do things better than his rivals. That's the DNA. That's the fact of life of Marc Marquez, the MotoGP rider. He's just always been better at some stuff, and it's hard to imagine. Age comes for us all, but it's hard to imagine that changing anytime soon. But what is true, as you've mentioned, fully fit in terms of rider terms, fully fit in terms of human terms. Obviously, this is a sport that takes a dramatic toll on a rider's body. And we measure age like humans do, the number of days, months, years since your birth. But in MotoGP rider terms, age, number of starts is kind of age. And that age is ticking up every weekend, more so even now under the sprint format. And certainly the number of injuries is age. And Mark himself has admitted that it's getting harder to, you've broken something again. And instead of spending a winter playing Call of Duty, sitting around doing stuff, you have to go do multiple hours of physio or whatever. You have to go put your body through pain so that it's ready to then be put through more pain in travel around the world, do 22 rounds in different parts of the world where you're still, carrying injuries that you had like 5 or 6 or 7 months ago, or injuries that you had in 2020, because that's never going to be fully healed. It is very easy to imagine a situation. I think it is realistic to imagine a situation where even the fairy tale scenarios of reuniting with Honda, or trying to go for 10 MotoGP titles, or having a new rival that, kind of gets his goat a little bit and he wants to show him off, or a rival like Pedro Acosta, for example, or a resurgent Fabio Quartararo somewhere. It's very easy to imagine scenarios where those things aren't quite enough to justify the continued sacrifice, which this life is, especially for a guy who's been doing this at this level since 2013, since arriving to MotoGP at this very level, always in contention, always winning.
And always crashing and always getting hurt, always racking up that physical tally, that bill that you have to pay at some point. That that his is higher than probably anyone in the modern era, apart from Dani Pedrosa's. He has been through a lot of injuries, a lot of issues, a lot of serious injuries as well. That's something that I think is quite unique to Marc Marquez in modern terms, in that Dani Pedrosa broke himself a lot and will likely wake up more in quite a bit of pain on cold mornings for the rest of his life because of that. But none of those issues, none of those crashes, none of those injuries ever really had the impact or the possibility to have a long-term impact in Dani Pedrosa's life. Marc Marquez could have another crash tomorrow that brings back the double vision issues that maybe then never go away again. He's battling a whole different type of injury from most of his peers. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if motivation is starting to just struggle a little bit. I think that one thing that probably works in his favor, or works in the MotoGP fandom's favor, if you consider how important Marc Marquez is to the sport, is that his brother Alex is here in racing and probably looking to race on a little bit longer, because I think that will always be an anchor that keeps Marc here. It's going to be harder for Marc to retire while Alex is still here, fitter, younger, and winning. But there will come a day. There will come a point. And Marc himself has been quite open about this. He's talked quite a lot recently in various formats, including in an interview with myself, about how essentially when the day comes that he isn't winning anymore, that's the point where it is time to hang up the keys to the MotoGP bike and park it. Okay, we're a long way away from that right now as things look, but we're going into 27 with a big contract reshuffle, a big technical regulations reshuffle, a new tire manufacturer, and the possibility for that moment to come maybe sooner than anyone anticipates.
Yep. And before that, we're going into 26 that looks more complicated than it did maybe 9 months ago, for instance, 8 months ago, 7 months ago, which is not to say that he isn't still the favorite to win the championship, the favorite to win the opening race, even though he's not 100% fully fit, because again, this is still a guy who can do things that are inaccessible to his rivals in certain, bands of performance, etc. This is still a guy that, as it stands, you will always back over a 22 round calendar, assuming he is healthy. What's your feeling been on this preseason? Because he hasn't really necessarily been definitively fastest at any point, apart from the early morning qualifying simulations of the final day. He's been there or thereabout consistently at Sepang, a track that he doesn't like. He's in the mix. At Buriram, he has obviously been in the mix. He wasn't healthy at Buriram, not just the lingering, continuing shoulder recovery from last year, but also a stomach sickness of some sort. And you've told me that he looked quite worn down in the paddock, and that will certainly impact you, and it will have contributed to the fact that he crashed 3 times across 2 races. But there is every sign that at least that humongous margin that he pressed so well in 2025 doesn't really exist anymore, and that it is going to be a harder season while also still being very, very long.
I think that as anyone that has listened to our content will know, I tend to be quite skeptical sometimes about a lot of the things that writers say to us, media, and Marc in particular, because he's the master of PR spin, of media. But when he said at the end of the test in Buriram that he was more positive than he had been throughout all of the preseason, I kind of believed him, because I think that what we saw was him only really starting to put the elements together on the final day of the final test to convince himself that this was going to be an okay season, because Sepang was a bit hit or miss, both for him and for Ducati. We saw them revert, essentially scrub the 2026 Aero, throw it in the bin, go back to 2024's wings, not even the 25 stuff, because the bike wasn't working. So they've made big changes. The bike hasn't been where he needed it to be, and then he turned up to Buriram where things should have been a bit better, and he spent all weekend, 2 days, not well. Reduced energy levels, visibly not himself. And it seems like he convinced himself right at the end of that test that he found something on the final day, that he found enough to be where he needs to be. And I mean, I tend to trust what he's saying right now, but it hasn't been a plain sailing preseason. And I think that's been reflected in the fact that what we thought was going to be a fairly easy contract renewal still, as of right now, hasn't happened.